Hi, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of Old Scribes. Thank you for joining us. My co-host, George Willis, is taking the week off. But I want to introduce a very special guest that we have today, author Steve Hunt, who recently completed a very, very good book, especially for a boxing junkie like myself, Heavyweight Title Fights of the 1980s. There it is. There's the book. Cover with Tyson and Bruno, one on the cover. Steve, thanks a lot for joining.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's great to meet you. Great to talk to you. I've seen you on Twitter, X, for a long time. I like the stuff that you do, and so it was a great opportunity to come and speak to you about the book, of course.
Great, thank you. So yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind when I as I'm reading your book is that it is just filled with, so every title fight is like a mini story. I mean, it's and for someone like me who, I don't know if we're the same age or not, or if you grew up in this era, but this is precisely the kind of book that gets my juices flowing, because it's the intricate details of some of these fights that really makes them even more interesting than they already were, since I kind of grew up in this era. What made you, what was the impetus for starting to write a book like this that detailed every heavyweight fight of the 1980s, or heavyweight title fight rather?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because initially the plan was to cover the decade in the heavyweight division in even greater detail. It's only when I kind of looked into how big that book would be that I had to scale it back, because I was initially going to cover every fight that was various contenders against different contenders. But when I started doing my sums and looked at the possible word count, it was just going to be unfeasible. So I had to restrict it to the title fights.
Did you grow up a boxing fan? I mean, what was the because like I said, someone like me, this is exactly like I could read something like this all day. Did you grow up in this era?
Yeah. So I grew up really with boxing in the last half of this decade. So yeah, my first Ring magazine had Sugar Ray Leonard on the cover the month after he beat Marvin Hagler, and so I was the right age for the rampaging Mike Tyson. Don't really recall ever watching any Larry Holmes fights live, but I was exactly the right age for this decade. This is the decade that I remember. This is the decade that got me into boxing. This is the decade I started going deep into it. I've always loved boxing writing. I read every magazine that I could get my hands on back in those days. And of course, back in those days, there was plenty of those magazines. You know, there was KO, there was The Ring, there was World Boxing, there was all kinds of stuff, Boxing Illustrated, Boxing News in this country, of course, luckily, a weekly magazine back then, and still now with Boxing News. So I was the right age for this. And, the reason for me writing this book, if I don't know what you're saying about the details of it, if I hadn't written this book, I would also be the perfect person to read this book, because that's what I love. I love those stories. I love those details that from this distance now of time have kind of been forgotten.
Yes. It's interesting that you bring up, because I mean, I think we grew up reading the exact same magazines, the exact same articles. I was a huge KO magazine fan. And one time I went up to Steve Farhood. I had never met him before. And I saw him at a fight, and I said, if you read my columns or my features or my stories or whatever, they sound a lot like you. Because I grew up reading Steve Farhood and Nigel Collins, and so I always feel like my style is a lot like theirs. So it sounds like you grew up with the exact same authors and the same sports writers and boxing writers that I did.
Yeah, I've said a few times actually on various platforms that basically I started doing a paper round when I was about 13 years old. So that allowed me to go into, I used to go into the newsagents where I collected my papers from and basically take the magazines off the shelves and sit there and read them. And then put them back when I was ready to go and do the paper round, and then go back the next day and pick up where I left off. So I was able to, because obviously some of those magazines were too expensive for me to buy on the little money that I was earning. But I still managed to read them all by virtue of going and doing this paper round.
Yeah. So let me ask you this: what is this something? Is this a project that you had been wanting to do for a while? Why did you want to write this book?
For as long as I can remember, I've wanted to write a boxing book, but I didn't know how to go about it. I didn't know what subject to cover, and I'm never having written a book before. It felt like a mission impossible, really. But in the last few years, I started writing articles and writing quite a lot of articles that got published on various websites and luckily enough in Boxing News magazine. And then I just had this idea about doing this type of book where it felt like a doable book for me, because as you said, it's essentially 46 separate stories. I knew I could write an article at 2,000 words, 2,500 words, 3,000 words. And so what this book is essentially is 46 of those, but when you string them together, they create one overarching narrative. So for a first book, it felt like something that I knew I could do. It was just going to take time, but it wasn't something that felt overwhelming. And I wanted to write this book because I love that period of time and that weight division. And I feel it is an overlooked kind of period. I've made the point several times that I'm not trying to claim that the 80s in the heavyweights is a golden age, right, but I think it's just an overlooked period because people often talk about the 70s, of course, understandably. They talk about the 90s, of course, again, understandably, but that decade in the middle is overlooked. And I think it's a fascinating decade because you've got essentially the peak of pretty much the entire peak of Larry Holmes, and then his quest for Rocky's record when he finally admitted that he was going for it. Then you've got his decline, the controversial fights with Michael Spinks, and then, of course, the HBO Unification series, which was the first time any of the titles had come together since the late 70s. And that in itself is fascinating, even without the inclusion of Tyson in it. And, of course, the rise of Tyson is just, I know that's been covered elsewhere before, but not necessarily in the way that I've done it, I think, and in that structure. So it just felt like it was a subject I was fascinated by and a project that I felt that I could achieve as someone writing my first book.
Yeah, it's funny about the era because despite its shortcomings, which there were a lot, it was kind of known for a long time for an era where fighters just didn't reach their potential. The Greg Pages and the Michael Dokes, Tony Tubbs, guys who are really talented, but just never seemed to really put the pedal to the metal and really see how far they could go with it for various reasons. What is it about this era, do you think, that despite its shortcomings continues to kind of resonate with people?
Well, I certainly think, Larry Holmes at long last is getting his due respect. And I think obviously the rise of Tyson is, fascinates people. And those characters that you're talking about, that are lumped together as the lost generation of heavyweights, I think they are fascinating characters. And yes, as you've said, there are the likes of Tony Tubbs, even Tim Witherspoon, plenty of them didn't reach their full potential. And so I thought it was worth shining a light on them because I still think they are quality boxers. And I think I make the point in the conclusion that I think sometimes this is an overlooked era because people see that WBA belt getting handed around all the time by so many different fighters. Yeah. But it was the era where the proliferation of titles really kicked off with the introduction of the IBF midway through the decade. And if you forget the alphabet title belts and you just think of Larry Holmes as champion, then Michael Spinks, then Mike Tyson, and just think of all the other fights as just fights between contenders, I think it looks a lot healthier, that decade. And that decade is not alone in having fighters that didn't reach their potential. I always think of Riddick Bowe would have fit perfectly in the 80s. His his best fight was his fight when he won the title, and was he ever better ever again? That's classic. Yeah. That's classic Tim Witherspoon. That's classic, Greg Page type stuff. We've always had fighters that don't reach their potential, but the 80s did have, I think most people would agree that between Tyson and Holmes, they are two of the all-time greats. Whatever people might, I know people's views of Tyson vary, understandably, but they are two of the all-time greats. And we had a decent bunch of contenders, but flawed contenders, but still they were interesting people, and Michael Dokes, for instance, a star in the making, considered a star in the making. At one stage, I remember reading a Ring magazine where they were looking at, and this was relatively early in the 80s, Larry Holmes is near the end of his time. Who's going to be the next one to take his place? Mm-hmm. And at this point in time, they were talking about Michael Dokes. Mm-hmm. And it was downhill all the way from there until he came back and had that moderately successful comeback and that amazing war with Evander Holyfield to show what he really had, even when he was pretty much washed up, and he'd put his body through all kinds of terrible stuff. I find these guys fascinating. Tony Tubbs is another one. Took a streaking Riddick Bowe in the early 90s, the full 10 rounds, and give him a tough fight. Tony Tubbs was a good fighter. He just didn't. He just wasn't motivated. And Greg Page. I wrote an article from our website about Greg Page's debut. Greg Page, even at that stage, admitted he'd really rather be playing basketball. It was just that boxing was what he was best at. And when you're an excellent amateur boxer and you happen to be a heavyweight and you happen to come from Louisville, it's going to be hard for you to opt for a career in basketball. Yeah. But his is an incredible story, Greg Page, and very obviously a tragic ending, as with many of them.
Yeah. With Page, I remember, the complaint was always early on that he was too heavy, right? He was talented but too heavy. And I remember he came into the Trevor Berbick fight, slim and trim, and everyone was like, okay. I think it was on the undercard of Holmes Cooney. Everybody was like, okay, so finally we get to see the real Greg Page. Well, he looked terrible and he lost. So everybody was like, well, maybe he's better fat, right? Maybe he's better when he's heavy.
Yeah.
That was kind of the fighter he was.
Something to that. I mean, let's be honest, like Andy Ruiz has been through that type of thing, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Felt like if he needed under pressure to take too much weight off and it just didn't suit him. So I don't think it was always, Greg Page's prime weight for being comfortable as a boxer was probably heavier than people wanted to see him. He was, even when he was losing in those fights in the 80s, he was going the distance. So it wasn't an engine that was letting him down. It wasn't that he was, overweight and breathing out of his arse, basically, by the second half of fights. That wasn't the case with him. He was just temperamental in terms of not always delivering his best. I don't necessarily think it was always about the weight, although, he wasn't in love with training.
Yeah. And like you said, I mean, he always seemed to be just not very interested to be there, right? A lot of it was just kind of going through the motions.
Yeah. And then unbelievably, when he finally got his title shot, well, he had two title shots. The first title shot was when he fought for the vacant title against Tim Witherspoon, and he did, and then he'd been WBC #1 contender for quite a while, and then blew it and was outworked and outmuscled by Witherspoon, and then he had to wait a while and got another shot. He was prepared to go to South Africa to fight Jerry Kurtzer when other black fighters weren't prepared to go down there. But Greg Page's opinion was, look, no one's giving me anything here. I've got to take what I can get. And then he goes and knocks out Jerry Kurtzer in an 8th round of a round that went on for 4 minutes.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Incredible, crazy kind of stories. And then he goes and after all this, you think, okay, that year, the year that he won the title from Jerry Kurtzer, at the end of that year, the Ring magazine gave him the Comeback of the Year award, and then he lost his first defense.
In a terrible and one of the all-time worst fights ever. I mean, that was so bad. I remember somebody, I think it was Farhood, he wrote a story, and if you could find it, it's probably in, sometime in the January 1985 issue of KO magazine, where it's just a complete parody article mocking that fight. It was because it was exactly 2 weeks after Hagler Hearns,
Yeah.
and Farhood just went to town on him and just worked him over more than they worked each other over in the fight. And yeah, it was it was just a terrible, terrible fight, which you obviously document in your book. A quick story. In 1982, I was in like the summer going into like 8th grade, and my family's from New Mexico, and a tiny little town called Carrizozo, New Mexico. And out of the blue, and I was a huge boxing fan by then, out of the blue, Randall Tex Cobb is setting up training camp in Carrizozo, New Mexico.
Wow.
So obviously I went into the high school gym and watched it, watched him train, watched him. And as it turned out, there was a connection between my dad, who was a high school football coach in Texas, and his brother, Marty. They knew each other somehow. But I got to sit there. It was like a dream. I got to sit there and watch Tex Cobb train, and his wisecracks and, his amazing sense of humor. And he was there for a good 2 months probably. And I watched him for about 2 weeks. And at the time he was training for Mike Weaver.
Okay.
He was training for a fight to fight Mike Weaver. Fight never happened.
Yeah.
Cobb ended up fighting Holmes. And as and then Weaver fought Quick Tillis.
Yeah.
As you say, the fighting cowboy, as you put in your book. So yeah, it was just interesting because a lot of the what you appear to happen, you kind of assumed that like Holmes and Cobb were always going to fight each other, but that wasn't the case. I mean, he was going to fight. He was going to fight Weaver, and he ended up fighting Holmes. And I think the Weaver fight, that's a fight he possibly could have won.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember looking at all that and how Weaver was out of the ring for a lot longer than he wanted to be because there were scheduled fights against Tex Cobb and obviously talk of potentially Jerry Cooney, all this type of stuff. And then the WBA, he'd been out of the ring long enough that the WBA forced him to fight James Tillis, which was a dull fight and went 15 rounds.
Another terrible fight, yeah.
Legitimately say was down to ring rust, although these days that's the type of break that fighters take anyway, and ring rust doesn't seem to exist anymore for some fighters.
Right.
But Mike Weaver was an unlucky guy. He could have been getting that fight with Tex Cobb. That would have been a good fight. That would have been an interesting fight, wouldn't it?
It would have been much better than Holmes and Cobb. I mean, that was an obvious mismatch from the beginning, and it turned out exactly the way everybody thought. But I remember at the time thinking, wow, this could be a really, really good fight. And, because look at Weaver and Coetzee, right? That was a great fight. I think it probably would have been something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Cobb is one of those characters, isn't he? He's one of the cast of characters that I hope makes my book interesting because he's an interesting character, probably the wittiest of the fighters of the decade.
100%.
Just a fascinating guy. Absolute value for money.
So speaking of that, talk about some of the, research that you had to do for this. And also I got Alexa thinking that I'm talking to her. Alexa, shut up. Talk about the research and the length of time that it took you to write this.
Well, despite the fact I've got a full-time job, I managed to write this. I feel I wrote this book quite quickly because it took me 14 months from when I started to when I felt like I had a draft that I was ready to present to people. In terms of the research, I absolutely loved every minute of it because I basically have a lot of like boxing books. So I've got a lot of the biographies of the fighters involved. And then I own every Ring magazine from the 1980s anyway, or I accumulated those during this process. Mm-hmm. So they were really useful in terms of especially the rankings, tracking fighters through the rankings and reading the contemporary fight reports in there. And then, of course, the best resource was, archival newspaper coverage, which is back in those days, plentiful, because most cities had many cities had more than one paper, and they all had boxing writers. So there was such a depth of coverage, of these fights, in the lead up to the fight and then afterwards. So I was not short of material, to try and pick out those facts that made these stories, these facts and these details that made these stories interesting, that made one run into the next, and why these fights got made, why fights didn't get made, in the journeys of these individual guys. And of course, the beauty of it is all of these fights are on YouTube. If I was buying this book, if I hadn't written it and I was buying it, I'd read about it, watch the fight, read about the fight, watch the fight. I think that's the best way to do it, because it's all out there, isn't it? It really gives it an extra color. So that
is exactly what I did. That's what I did. I was reading and I was like, okay, I got to go back watch. Holmes and Lorenzo Zanone, right? Anyway, continue.
Yeah, I mean, I like to think, say for instance, for each of those fights, on average, they're probably about 2,000 words, something like that. Some a little less, some a little bit more. It's not, as you've said, it's not he threw a left hook, he threw a right hand, that type of thing. If an article is about 2,000 words, there may only be 300, 400 words about what happened in the ring. It's about the build up, and then the political stuff, the characters, and then the aftermath, and where the characters go from there. So that's what I hope makes it more interesting, because you can go and watch, these fights. You don't need me to tell you too much about the absolute details of the fight, but there's enough in there about the fights that if you don't want to go and watch the fights, there's enough for you to get the flavor of what happened from bell to bell. Yeah,
that's exactly right. You seem like a pretty big boxing fan. Tell me about, your kind of fascination with the sport and how it started.
So the earliest fighter I can remember being pretty much obsessed with was Lloyd Honeyghan, obviously a British fighter, and his win over Don Curry. That kind of fascinated me because no one gave him a chance. And obviously in this country, that fight, living in this country, in the UK, that fight was in the middle of the night. And I remember waking up, and because I'd been quite obsessed about it, my mum had left me a note by the side of my bed to say Honeyghan won, because she was always up late at night and she knew that I was interested. And I was getting up to do my paper round, as I was saying, and she'd left me this note by the side of my bed by my alarm clock to say Honeyghan won, stopped Curry in the 6th. And I thought, I can't believe it. I'd been reading back in those days in the English newspapers, you would have like coverage every day of the week leading up to a big fight like that, big fight for Britain. And every day, no one was giving him a chance. No one was giving him a chance. But Honeyghan was going over there and saying, I'm not here, I'm not here to lose, and all this type of stuff. So that really kicked it off for me. I was like so impressed by someone that said they were going to do something that no one else said they could do, and then doing it in those beautiful shorts. And, unlike many British boxers, he was a bit cocky, and I kind of like that as well. So that's where it started for me. And I don't know. When I went to university, I did my degree was in journalism, so I'm always interested in writing. Although I never pursued that for many years. Mm-hmm. But when I was in my first year at university doing this journalism degree, I made contact with now Kelly Maloney, formerly Frank, of course, with a view to writing a piece about Kelly and her involvement with the sport, and Lennox Lewis, of course. And I was lucky enough, she was very kind to me, and I was lucky enough to then go and do some work experience during a university school holiday, summer holidays, which was the summer of '94, which was the summer that Lennox Lewis defended against Oliver McCall. Mm-hmm. So bad outcome for a British fight fan. Yeah. But I spent 3 weeks working in that office, and it was just the best 3 weeks of my life up to that point. And possibly still is, because I was just, I got to be in the same room as Don King, a man that I got no time for, but it was quite wild, being at these press conferences, various people coming into the office. So that was a big thing for me there. But I've just always been a fan. I've never boxed myself, but I've just always been a fan. Had waves of it, periods where I've been less interested. where certain things
Sure.
have kind of put me off the sport. I think that's fairly natural. But yeah, really loved it. Now I've been a subscriber to Boxing News since I was about 13. It's nearly 40 years or whatever that is. So yeah, always loved it.
I just wrote something for Boxing News. Come out next week on Bobby Ches.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah. Speaking of, your book was at the Battle for Bobby. It was one of the prizes, right? That people, I guess, for the raffle. I think it was a raffle.
Yeah.
A lot of the greatest fighters in boxing history holding up your book, Steve. That's pretty cool.
I know. It was like that is, getting this published is the best thing that's ever happened in my life professionally.
That's great.
And then it ending up in the hands of Larry Holmes, Michael Spinks, Tim Witherspoon, and Jerry Cooney was just the icing on the cake. It all came about because the guy that organised that benefit for Bobby just found me on social media and bought a copy from me, just purely out of wanting to own a copy. And then he got back in touch a little later, and said that he was organising this benefit and would I be prepared to donate a copy for the raffle. I was like, sure. So I sent another one over. And then he told me he was going to be there, or who he was hoping to be there. And I was like, all the while I was writing this book, I was thinking, if there's some way I could get a copy to Larry Holmes, that would be unbelievable. And then it just fell into my hands, this opportunity. So I said, look, if there's any way you can just get a photo of any of those guys, with the book, because I knew he was going to ask them to sign it for the raffle. So I knew they were going to hold it, just if I could get a photo. And yeah, sure enough, on Sunday night, these photos came through from him. And I was just like, oh my word, I spent all Sunday night, Monday, just looking at my phone, looking at these photos. Because yeah, that's really, I'm still a fan. I'm still a kid at heart, really, when it comes to, as we all are, I think, so when we're not cynical old men, we're the flip side is we're kids obsessed with these guys, with these guys we hold up as heroes. So seeing my work, and I like to think I've given Larry Holmes a lot of respect in my book, and so if he ever actually reads any of it, but just to see him holding it was just tremendous for me.
That's great. I was glad to see, because Steve, this is a real boxing book, and it appeals to real fight fans. And I think it's very appropriate that it was raffled off, because that's a real boxing event to help a real fighter. So I was happy to see that, and congratulations to you for that. Talk about a little bit about your background. I know you live in England. Talk about where you grew up and all that.
So I grew up in Northampton in England. Well, I grew up in a smaller town close to Northampton called Daventry. No one will have heard of Daventry. Probably not many people have heard of Northampton that are listening to this or watching this.
Give me the sizes. What are the sizes of the two towns?
I think Northampton's probably got about 250,000 people.
Okay.
So it's not tiny. It's not considered a city in this country, but it is a large town. There are small, population-wise, there are smaller cities. I mean, and obviously compared to the US, England is such a small country anyway. So on the train, we're only a little over an hour from London, and a little over about an hour from Birmingham. So it's very central. But there's not an awful lot going on here. The best thing probably about where I live is the transport links to places that are better. But it's not a bad place to live. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about where there's nothing boxing wise here. There's an amateur boxing club here, but there aren't any. There's the odd very small professional show, but really to see boxing, you've got to go to London most of the time. There is some in Birmingham, sometimes Telford. Even Frank Warren seems to have got a thing about Telford for some reason recently. But there's not a lot of boxing here. Well,
but like you said, I mean, did you go to a lot of fights? I mean, you said Manchester. That was, I think Ricky Hatton when I think Manchester, and
Yeah, I did. I went to the first fight I went to. I was I can't believe my mum let me go to this, really, because I must have been about 16, because I'm sure I was still at school. I went to see, surprise, surprise, Lloyd Honeyghan, but it was the night, unfortunately, got smashed to bits by Mark Breland.
Oh yeah.
So that was a crushing experience, really. And then I think that was maybe 89, maybe 88, 89. And
That
then
was 89. Yeah.
the next year would have been, I saw Ben Eubank, the first fight at the NEC in Birmingham.
Oh wow.
And then I also was lucky enough to go to, because there's not much boxing there now, but it's a great venue, the Royal Albert Hall, to see Dennis Andries sharing top of the bill, or maybe he might have been top of the bill because he was WBC champion at the time. And chief support was Kirkland Lang, who's another British favourite, underachiever, but a very flamboyant character, great to watch. And then all through the 90s, I was going loads. I went to loads of fights, loads of Ricky Hatton. I was going up there, you know, I mean, that was, when was that? Would have been like more like the 2000s.
Hatton?
Yeah.
Like the mid 2000s, 2005 or 4.
He was at one stage, he was boxing like 3 or 4 times a year in Birmingham, in Manchester. And they were just great nights out. They were just superb nights out.
Yeah.
So I've been all over some NAS shows. I've been to New York once to see Lennox against Evander. I saw Lennox in London against Franz Botha towards the tail end of his career. So I used to go to a lot of fights between that period of late 80s through to around 2010. I think I went to David Hay against Audley Harrison and felt thoroughly disgusted that it was an awful fight. I felt like I'd been a fool for getting sucked into the hype. And that really put me off boxing for a long time. Yeah. The last fight I went to was, I've only been to a couple in recent years. I went to see when Lomachenko came to the UK against Luke Campbell. I thought I really wanted to see Lomachenko rather, of the two of those. Yeah, well, it was a good fight. I mean, a beautiful fight. Not often that you get to see that kind of skill level. And then I saw Josh Warrington against Carl Frampton, which was another corking fight. Those are the 2 most recent fights. But during my university years, 93 to 96, before then and during and after, I was going to a lot of fights. I went to the second Ben Eubank fight at Old Trafford with about 40,000 people. Back in those days, there wasn't that many stadium fights in this country. That was really special. I was at the Eubank Watson second fight, the very sad one where Watson got hurt.
Yep.
So I was actually on the pitch there at White Hart Lane. That was an incredible night because it was autumn and outdoors. It was just really an unusual kind of atmosphere. But yeah, Britain is a great country for atmosphere at sporting events and boxing.
Right now, I would say it's one of the best atmospheres for boxing. You know, I mean, it's somehow I think America has kind of lost its knack for hosting events. The crowds always seem a little quiet and just not as into it, and that could be directly related to the lack of interest in the sport over here. But whenever I see a fight in the UK, it just seems like the crowd is not only into it, they're knowledgeable. They know what's going on. They know the fighters. They know, that's what I see. I've never been, and I'd love to, but that's what it seems like to me.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you. And I wonder whether in America, it seems to me sometimes you see fights in the States, sadly not enough these days, but you see fights in the States. And I'm thinking, why is that fight in that city?
Yeah.
When like in the UK, of course, because again, it's such a smaller country, we will, fighters will fight in their hometowns and home cities, and therefore that will create an atmosphere. But if you've got a bunch of high rollers in Las Vegas watching 2 fighters from different parts of the country or whatever, it's not going to be quite the same, is it?
No.
And the boxing model has most definitely changed, hasn't it? There's less big time boxing in New York and Philadelphia, Los Angeles, it feels to me. And obviously, I think the drain, it's going in the wrong direction, isn't it? Anyway, because even, there'd be a better atmosphere in Vegas than there will be in Saudi. So, it's getting worse, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not going to be 2 local fighters in a boxing specific venue. It's moved then to 2 random fighters in a casino.
Hmm.
And now it's two random fighters halfway around the world in a 6,000 seat stadium in Saudi Arabia.
That's
But
right.
no one's got a connection to it.
And no connection, and no one's going to travel, and no one's going to, like back in the day, you had Pernell Whitaker in Norfolk, and Orlando
Yeah,
Canizales in Laredo, and Virgil Hill and Bismarck.
yeah, yeah.
You had these fighters with these huge followings because they fought often in their hometown or in their region. Well, Salvador Sanchez was hugely popular in the United States as well as Mexico. Why? Because he fought in San Antonio, he fought in El Paso, he fought in Phoenix, he fought in Vegas, he fought in LA, he fought, you know what I mean? He fought in all those places. He was recognized, people enjoyed him. So a lot, I've always said this for a long time. It's about visibility. People have to be able to see the fighters. And as you said, if they just plop two fighters from two different areas in a place that fans aren't knowledgeable enough these days to know who they are, and they're not, it's not going to have any interest there.
Yeah, and the business model has moved towards ticket sales being of less importance.
Yes.
So, if ticket sales were important, you'd be putting Terence Crawford in his home city where he was drawing huge crowds.
Yes.
And building that support. But it doesn't matter anymore, does it? The ticket sales are less important, which can't be really healthy long term.
So, winding down here, talk about, we're kind of talking about it now a little bit, but you spent all this time on the book and this era. Compare this era, I guess, heavyweight wise, to today's era. What comparisons can you draw? What is the same? What is different?
When I wrote the book, it was at the stage where it was really stale, I felt, because fights weren't getting made, because I'm the A side, I'm the A side, he's the B side, so I'm going to take 80%, you'll take 20, no, I won't, all that kind of nonsense. It was, are we going to get Fury against Joshua? No, we're going to get Fury against Dillian White. That's what was happening. Things have got better now, of course, in terms of the fights being made. But that's because of the Saudi money. So that's a good thing, but in my mind, also a bad thing. So as an armchair fan, just consuming your diet of fights, it's good, but it's a little bit worrying as to how those fights are getting made. So you compare it back to the 80s, in that the fights generally did get made. Mm-hmm. The biggest difference, of course, I guess, is the way that we consume the sport, in terms of all the media, from the broadcast media. Now, you can watch boxing on an app, but everything costs. And in the old days, in the first half of the 1980s, everything was on free TV, and then you got the rise of HBO. So pay TV came on the scene, but again, at least they brought the fighters together in that unification. So I don't know. I don't think the fighters are any better now than they were then. I know I sound like what I am, like an older fan thinking, oh yeah, better in my day. Mm-hmm. But I just don't see how you can be a really good fighter when you don't fight that often. When you're a part-time fighter, you can't possibly kind of learn the skills. But I don't blame them for not fighting as often, because it's a dangerous sport and you should get in and get out with as much money as you can and with your health intact. So yeah, I would say, I think Alexander Usyk is a fantastic heavyweight who would lived in any era.
Yep.
So you plop him down in the 90s, the 80s, the 70s, he's mixing it with the best. I'm not going to give you a prediction here and now about him against Larry Holmes or him and Mike Tyson, but he would have, he's in that conversation, isn't he? But until he came along, I think, even though obviously everyone in this country was a fan of AJ because he brought a lot of excitement, maybe he's been a bit exposed, but still, he really did bring excitement and a willingness most times to fight everyone who was put in front of him. Yep. So, I appreciate him for that. And I think he's in that period of his career where he was loved. Now he's down there a bit because so people are kind of mocking him a little bit. Give it time, and when we look back on him and you look back on his career, hopefully he'll be reassessed. Not as one of the greats, but you can't really assess someone until their career is entirely over. So yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on how you would compare today, maybe to an earlier era.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. I mean, I would agree that Usyk is head and shoulders the guy of this era. He could compete in any era, and yeah, I wouldn't want to pick between he and Larry Holmes. I would probably lean toward the '80s era, toward it's definitely Holmes and Tyson in those kind of matchups. But yeah, he certainly is company in that era for sure. He's one of the all-time greats for sure.
The reason I was so pleased I'm not a fan of Tyson Fury. The reason I was so pleased to see Usyk beat Fury is that I got sick of the narrative, really, that to be successful in the heavyweight division, you need to be 270 pounds, you need to be 6'7". Yeah. Usyk has put that to bed, hasn't he? It is about the skills. It is about skills. It is about timing. It is about durability. It is about consistency. It is about work ethic. It is about having a game plan. It is about a plan B. It's about dealing with adversity. Those are the skills and attributes that are going to get you at the top and keep you at the top. And we can't expect everyone to have them. He's got them, and I just think, I got sick of unless someone's 260 pounds, 270 pounds. They're not going to get anywhere, because Usyk has ripped that up well and truly.
Yes, absolutely. There was a point where I was thinking Fury was in the conversation after his Wilder wins, and he looked really good in a lot, in especially the second one. Big, strong, talented heavyweight, who could do a lot in the ring. I just think that ultimately, his lifestyle and his lack of fighting and his attitude all caught up with him, and age, right? But like history tends to do, it all, in about 10 years we can have this conversation and it'll all be in place, right? It's a little too recent to like be able to like determine it now, but in 2035 we'll have it all figured out, right, Steve?
Oh, for sure. But what I would say about Tyson Fury, let's say he's finished, and I can't see him coming back and doing anything that's going to enhance his legacy, even if he does come back. If he has finished, if you were to list his top 5 wins, I think you're going to have a hard. If you were to judge that, for instance, if you were going to use that as a way of judging him against the best of all time, it looks terrible. Because if you're putting Derek Chisora amongst your best 5 victories, come on, you're scraping the barrel. I'm with you. The trilogy with Wilder was amazing, and I'll give Fury immense credit for coming back from where he was. Although we have to remember, partly the reason why he was where he was through failing drug tests, which is absolutely despicable. But to come back from being overweight, suffering with depression and all that stuff, was a tremendous achievement. And that epic trilogy with Wilder, you could sit down and watch any day of the week, couldn't you? But I think if you look beyond that, there's not much. There's not much on his record.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at it through the lens of, it's going on right now, and you're looking at it not only about what he's done, he's coming off a 3rd great fight with Wilder, but you're also looking to the future of, okay, he could potentially fight Joshua, or he could potentially fight, Usyk, and if he wins those 2, then he would be an all-time. You know what I mean? Like, you're still kind of projecting to the future, and I think that's what I was doing. A lot of other people were doing. Yeah. But now that he did lose the 2 fights with Usyk, I think that was his opportunity in my mind. Are you good or are you great? And he was asked that question twice, and we got the answer. He's very good. He's not
despite his size advantage, he was beaten by a man with better skills. Tyson Fury, whatever he might say about, being the best and whatever else, he never proved he was the best in the UK. You know, many people feel that at their peaks he would have beaten AJ, but we never saw it.
Right.
You know, and that counts against both of them. And even if they fight now, it counts less because it's too late. So to be the, you know, that's why, again, credit to Usyk, and thank, you know, I don't want to give too much credit to Turkey, but at least we got that to see, because without Turkey's money, we probably never would have got to see Usyk Fury. So we would have never got to find out. So we would have had all these unknowns, the unknowns that blight AJ's career, that blight, you know, he never got to see AJ against Wilder. Mm-hmm. You know, they were both heavyweight title holders for so long without meeting each other. It's just bad. It's bad for the sport, and it stains their record.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's always been that way in boxing, but now it is that way on steroids, right? It's like, you know, I remember, you know, Leonard and Hearns, you know, they didn't fight exactly when we thought they should have fought, right? Hearns had just beaten Cuevas, and everyone was like, okay, that needs to be the next fight. Well, it was Angelo Dundee who said, no, we're gonna let it, you know, we're gonna let it percolate a little bit. And they did, and it ended up being perfect. But that period was only a few months. You know, back then it seemed like 5 years, but it was only a few months. It was like less than a year. Now they do it, they marinate fights to the point where they don't happen. And that's on boxing, that's on the sport, that's on the promoters, that's on the fighters.
Yeah, and it's taken a business model where that is prepared to lose money to make those fights happen. Yeah. No one could create there wasn't a business model that was able to make money and make those fights happen. And that's the problem, because there was still plenty of money in boxing, but it needed Turkey to come along and the Saudis to come along and to not care about losing money. We're going to make these fights whatever. So you can forget about being the A side or the B side. We're just going to chuck so much money at you that it's going to happen. But if the Saudis ever withdrew, I wonder what would happen. They wouldn't have to get used to only accepting an amount of money that could be earned at the box office, both ticket money and TV sales, you know, like it used to be. If the fight won't make money for everyone involved, it won't happen. And you can make as many demands as you like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and that's a real possibility, right? I mean, this could happen for a few months or years, and then all of a sudden he's gone, and what is boxing left with, right? I mean, it could be a good thing, because then promoters will have to actually, maybe, you know, the TV won't be so automatic. They'll have to work to sell tickets at particular places, and maybe it'll have a return to the roots that we're talking about, which is they have to sell tickets in cities and build up fan interest.
Yeah. Well, so who knows? It would be. That's why it's just precarious, isn't it? Because there's no guarantee the Saudis will stay involved.
Right. None whatsoever. But for the time being, you know, let's enjoy the fights they make.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Steve, I feel like I could sit here and talk to you like all afternoon, but tell us where everybody can find the book.
Well, yeah, you can. It's available on Amazon. I guess it's available on all decent online bookstores. I've got copies myself, so people can find me on social media or through my website, stevehuntboxing.com, if they want a signed copy. Obviously, I guess the majority of people watching this will be in the US. Obviously, there's postage costs and what have you, but I have got copies if people want a copy direct from me.
Great. And yes, go out, buy the book, Heavyweight Title Fights of the 1980s by Steve Hunt. There it is. Tyson Bruno won right on the cover. A ferocious prime Mike Tyson. Steve, thanks a lot. It was a great talking to you. Great meeting you. And let's do it again.
I really appreciate it. I'd love to. Thanks a lot.